So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, I'll get started. And if we're able to share slides later on, we'll do that. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulullah, sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. There's a passage in the Quran that reads, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Inni Abdullah, Atani al-Kitaba, wa ja'alani nabiyya, wa ja'alani mubarakan ayna ma kuntu, wa awsani bis salati wa zakati, ma dumtu hayya. Indeed, I am a servant of God. He has given me the book, and He has made me a prophet, and He has made me blessed wherever I go. And He has enjoined upon me as-salah, the prayer, and zakah, as long as I live. So in the chat box, if I may ask, can anyone tell us which prophet, who is this talking about, the Quran, in this passage? Very good. Yes, the Prophet Isa alayhi salam. So this practice of zakah, when we look at zakah, it is not specific only to the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but also it comes from the long tradition of believers in God, and it has been part of spiritual practice since time immemorial. And today we'll talk about zakah, and the title of our session is Zakah and Strategic Philanthropy, a Pillar that Purifies. And indeed, the etymological root of zakah is purification. And what zakah does for us is it purifies our wealth. And as we'll discuss, it also has some very important economic and social benefits. And so when we implement zakah properly, then we can see a lot of good come about in our world. The objectives of what I would like us to do in this short session we have together is to, number one, emerge with a more thoughtful and strategic approach into how we purify our wealth, how we do zakah. And really, one thing I'll leave you with as a question is, how much do you think about zakah? And when we see how frequently in the Quran, salah and zakah are paired with one another, it's striking. And when we look at how much time we spend every day preparing for the prayer, offering the prayer, trying to improve our prayer, it's remarkable. Prayer is a very central part of our life. So how about zakah? How much time do we spend thinking about zakah? How much effort do we put into our zakah? And part of our goal today is to be more thoughtful about that and to appreciate some of the wisdom of zakah, the practices of zakah, the rules of zakah, etc. I'd also like us to, or each of us, to adopt at least one new perspective or idea about zakah. And towards the end of the session, I'll ask you to share any new ideas, anything fresh, anything that struck you from the conversation. So we can use the chat box later on for that. And the third objective that I put forward is that, excuse me? The third objective is to have at least one new practice, or think about one new way in which you can implement zakah in your day-to-day life and in your charitable giving. So this session that we have today is based on something that I did at the Mizan retreat this past summer. And that session, it was a longer couple of sessions we did for various groups, and so what we'll do today is a condensed version of that, and then also have some time hopefully for questions or for comments in the chat box, because this topic, as you'll see, is one with a great deal of nuance. And indeed, as the world of finance and as our financial practices evolve, so must our understanding of zakah. And so does our understanding of zakah. So we'll talk about the importance of zakah. We'll talk about some economic implications, some contemporary questions, including the calculation of zakah on various forms of wealth, how we think about the recipients of zakah, administrative aspects of zakat administration, and also some legal and regulatory compliance questions that are very relevant for us as being Muslims here in Princeton and the United States more broadly. And we'll think about also some more innovative practices around philanthropy that exist, including collective grant-making models, the idea of gifting appreciated securities, which is a very concrete but useful step, I believe, that we can think about in our zakat, and the use of donor-advised funds and charitable trusts for zakat. So with that, let me begin on the importance of zakat, which is something that you all know about, especially as we approach Ramadan. I know many like to give their zakat in Ramadan. Zakat can be given in Ramadan, it can be given outside of Ramadan, it can be given year-round, and in fact, in many traditional Muslim societies, zakat was given year-round. So people would give zakat consistently, and if you reflect on the social needs, of course, you see that they're not seasonal. They exist throughout the year. So there's a benefit in giving zakah frequently, as well as giving it in Ramadan, as I know many of us like to do. Zakah spiritually does many things for us. One is that it addresses a very basic human tendency that we have, which is towards miserliness and towards greed. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ told us that if this child of Adam were to have a valley of gold, he would wish to have 2 valleys of gold, and nothing fills his mouth except for dust. And we also know the Quran tells us, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم, وَمَن يُوقَ شُحَّ نَفْسِهِ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ. Whoever is saved from the covetousness of his or her own soul, indeed these are the successful people. And just as in Ramadan, we teach ourselves to hold back from our physical requirements, similarly our financial greed, our desire for wealth, our drive to increase our wealth can be tamed or reined in importantly by zakah. And also there's a very important aspect to remember, which is about purification. There's a beautiful ayah in the Quran, وَلَا يَسْتَوِي الْخَبِيثُ وَالطَّيِّبُ وَلَوْ أَعْجَبَتْكَ كَثْرَةُ الْخَبِيثِ. That the impure, the khabith, and the pure, the tayyib, are not equal. Even if you are amazed or you love the abundance of things that are impure. So if we have less wealth that is blessed versus more wealth that is lacking in blessing, the preference, of course, is to have the blessings and to have something that is spiritually sound. So that's very important. Let me move to economics. Now, one thing to remember about zakah is that it is assessed on wealth, accumulated wealth, and not on income. And this is a very different approach to wealth redistribution than income tax. And both have their place and both have their benefits. But if we reflect on this, one very basic but powerful implication of zakah is that if one holds on to his or her wealth and does nothing with it, then of course it will decrease year by year as he or she gives zakah. So that creates an automatic or natural incentive for a person to utilize that wealth, to invest that wealth and to grow it. And of course to do so at a rate that exceeds their zakah obligation. So it creates an incentive for wealth to circulate in the society, which is very, very important. In fact, also in the world of development, as you heard, I part of it is advise the United Nations on Islamic finance, and that includes zakah. And, you know, as we look at the world of development, there is an increasing appreciation or an emphasis on cash transfers. The idea that when we give people cash in their hands, it is beneficial to them. And that has more development impact than other things. And zakat, of course, does that, where it transfers wealth from one to another. There also are some very important social benefits. And, you know, as we think about the way we relate with one another, it is important in a society that those who have means recognize that the poor have rights over them. And indeed, zakah is often described by our scholars as a right of the poor over the rich. So the idea is that the wealth that you have, part of it actually belongs rightly or should be given to those who are in need. And when this is known in the society, that the wealthy have an obligation to the poor and they fulfill it. And similarly, when the wealthy know that they need to be engaged with those who need zakah, because without knowing them, without connecting with them, without being in touch with them, there's no way that they can fulfill this pillar of Islam, then it creates a very important level of social cohesion and social harmony. I see, Sajid, that now you are the host Sajid, are you able then to enable screen sharing?
Zach's going to try. Just give me a minute.
Okay, I'll keep going, and you can just jump in and tell me if and when that gets done. I see the question from Noor, which we'll certainly get to on 401k and pension, a very, very important question. In fact, the next section of our discussion is on this very question of how you calculate zakat. So we'll talk about how we calculate it, how we allocate it, and then some points around structuring and tax efficiency. And then we'll open it up for the questions. But please do share your questions along the way as they come to you, because it's a useful reference. With regards to zakah, if you ask anyone the textbook definition of how I calculate or one calculates zakah, they'll say there's a base case, if you will, of 2.5% on net cash above a threshold. That threshold is a nisab. It's called nisab in Arabic, held for 1 lunar year. So that's the base case, and that applies to gold, to silver, but of course for us today, what's much more relevant are the contemporary modern currencies in which we hold our wealth. So the base case, of course, is you look at the wealth that you've had in your ownership for 1 lunar year, which is one reason why people like giving in Ramadan. Of course, we're particularly attentive to the lunar year when it comes to Ramadan, but the same holds for Muharram, for Rajab, for any other month that you might choose for giving your zakat.
Excuse me, Aamir?
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
I'm trying to share screen with you. I think you should be able to show the slides. Does anything appear on your slide?
So when I try to, it says host disabled participant screen sharing. If you just disabled it, let me try again.
Yeah, I enabled it now. See if it works.
Okay, let's try again. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be working at the moment. Yeah. You know what I can do, Dr. Mania? Let me email you this presentation while we're talking, and perhaps we can do it that way.
Yeah. Okay. If you send it to me.
Yes.
Whenever you tell me, I'm going to try.
Yes, I will do that. If you can just take a pause for a minute, I will do that and then resume the discussion.
By the way, I'm not the host. Somebody is the host, but I'm going to try to take over and see if that works.
All right, let's see if we can do it. Otherwise, I can always share this later on. Okay, done. All right. So I've sent it, and hopefully you'll be receiving it. Perfect. So the 2.5%, as I said, is on wealth that has been in your possession for 1 year. Now, remember this again. This is a very important distinction between wealth and income tax, right? So if somebody is, living in a circumstance by which he or she spends all of their paycheck, or they never have a consistent base of savings that exceeds the nisab, then that person is not required to pay zakat. So you don't take the first of Ramadan, for example, look at all my assets, calculate 2.5%, and that's my zakah obligation. Not necessarily. What you have to do is understand what wealth you've had over the course of 1 year. So that's very important. Now, this nisab is calculated either on the basis of gold or the basis of silver, and there's a big difference between which you use. So it can be as little as $350 and as much as about $4,700, depending on the price of gold and silver at any particular time. So that's the threshold below which one is not obligated to pay zakah. Of course, one can always give charity, but the obligation of zakah is lifted on someone who doesn't have the nisab of wealth for the period of 1 year. Now, that, as I mentioned, is the base case on cash. However, most of us, or many of us, would have wealth in other forms, including the question that Noor asked regarding the 401k. Now, let's start with the question of stocks. With regard to stocks, now there are different opinions on this matter. One view is to treat stocks the way one treats cash. So, of course, you look at the value that you have had for 1 year, and you pay from that 2.5%. Another view of stock is to look at it as ownership of a business. And for those of you, I know I see several of you on the phone who own private businesses. So if you own a business, how do you pay zakah on that? And by extension, one could apply this to his or her stock portfolio. So when it comes to business ownership, the zakah rate is actually not 2.5%. It's higher. One view, and I basing this particular point on a book that I can share the reference to. It's called Zakat Collection. Zakat Calculation. The author's name is Mushfiq Rehman. It's published out of the UK, and it's based on the Shafi'i fiqh manual. And then there's a book based on the Hanafi madhab called A Believer's Guide to Zakat. And you'll find that there are differing views amongst the scholars on these topics. But the question of how do you pay zakah on a business? The view that we have in one of these books is a 10% threshold, which is derived from the principle of agriculture. So for those who own farms or do agricultural business, you pay zakah, of course, not on the value of the whole farm, but you pay it on 10% of the produce. So the analogy to a business is that if you own a business, then you don't value the business every year and pay 2.5% of that, but rather what you do is you look at the profit that you get from that business, net of taxes, net of expenses, net of liabilities. So what is the profit that you're deriving? And then you pay a portion of that. But that portion is not 2.5%, it's 10%. Now, another view is that it may be as low as 5%. And the basis for that is that we have in fiqh a distinction between zakah that's paid on agriculture that comes from land which is irrigated, which is a lower rate of 5%, and land which is not irrigated, which is 10%. And the rationale behind this could relate, of course, to the fact that irrigation requires the effort and the expense, etc. So in any case, the question of then how we treat stocks is either we treat it as we do a cash holding, or we treat it as a private business that we have a stake in. And the challenge with the latter, which is to treat it as a private business that you have a stake in, is you would have to calculate your share of the profits, which is not the same as a dividend. And we can talk about that later, but a dividend, of course, is paid from a portion of the profits. But to assess what your share of the profits are is a more complicated exercise. Real estate is similar to what we discussed with the business. So if you own real estate, the practice is to look at the profit that you derive after your maintenance fees, after any costs of debt associated with it, after other expenses you have. So what are you getting in terms of free cash flow? And then you apply on that your 10% rate for real estate. Now, the question that was raised about retirement accounts. To answer this question, we need to look at sort of the various elements of it, or things that, conditions that are called into question here. So one of them is do you own an asset? One pays zakah on things that he or she owns. So for instance, all of us or many of us on this call would be entitled to Social Security. We have in principle some kind of Social Security benefit. However, because we don't own it, we don't control it, we don't have access to it, we would not consider that our property. A 401k account would be deemed one's property. So you do own it. It is your asset. However, you know that your 401k, if your statement tells you that you have $100 in your 401k, if you were to withdraw that 401k, you actually would not get $100. You'd get something short of that. There would be penalties attached to it, etc. So basically, the way you would look at a 401k is, first of all, whether you see it as your property or not. If you say, yes, it's my property, then what is its value if I were to liquidate it? Because that would be at a discount to what its market value is. And that would be potentially your zakat liability on a 401k. If you have a pension benefit, as I mentioned, like a Social Security, or if you work for a company that promises a pension in the future, until that is your property, it is not something that would be subject to zakat. Again, according to the scholarship that we've researched on this. Things such as options There's a question here about the value of stocks fluctuating in a year. Let me answer that after this section here. Options and restricted stock units. So you may have these. You may have stock options. You may have what are called RSUs. If you do, then again, the question becomes: do you own them or do you not? Are they not yet vested, etc.? Do they have real value to you if you were to liquidate? And if not, then you would be exempt from zakat. Perfect. So we are now on slide number 5 of this presentation. So on slide number 5, where we are right now, which is entitled Calculating Zakat, we have, of course, agricultural assets, which I think would be less relevant for us. And then we have other forms of wealth that a person could have. One thing to think about for many of us is jewelry. Now, jewelry, of course, is gold, or can be gold, and there is it is important to be mindful of the zakat obligation. Now, things that one uses on a day-to-day basis are not subject to zakat. Just like the home in which one lives, one would not pay zakat. But if one has excess jewelry, it's important for us to be aware of how much we have, what the value of it is, and to pay our zakat on it. The treatment of debt, which is what you see here on the slide. So the treatment of debt is a very important question. And remember when we said that you pay zakah based on the wealth that you had for a year, net of debts that are associated with it. So one very pragmatic view of this is to say you look at your current or short-term debt, meaning you see what assets you have, you see what you owe in the short term, the immediate term, whether that be taxes, whether that be credit card debt, whether that be other debt that you owe to people in the very near future, and that you would not consider as part of your wealth. So let's say you have $100, but you owe 25 of that to other parties in the near future. You would pay your zakah on the 75, and you would count the 25 as liabilities that are not subject to zakat. Of course, this raises the question of long-term debt, like a mortgage. Now, the views that our contemporary scholars put forward on this is that one would not apply the full value of a mortgage. Let's say one lives in a house that's value is $300,000, and he or she has a $200,000 mortgage on it. Then it's very likely that if you were to apply your mortgage, if you were to take your wealth, subtract your mortgage, you would have no zakat liability. That, of course, is problematic because you can see how somebody in that circumstance, in fact, is a person of means. And so the way that we are advised to think about this is to look at our current portion of debt. So you would take, again, your snapshot of your assets. You would look at what mortgage payment you have due coming up. You subtract that, but then the rest of it, you would consider your wealth. There was a question before about stock and how it fluctuates. So remember, the principle is you look at your wealth that you've had in your possession for a lunar year. So if you're using the cash basis of stock, which is the safer way to say, look, I'll treat stock as if it was cash. Cash went up and your cash went down. So you would take the kind of the lowest point that it occurred, and that would be the minimum amount that you would apply for the zakat. Right? So because again, you wouldn't have had that value for the course of a year. So that's the principle that you would apply. When it comes to student debt, it's a question, very individual circumstances, but it could relate to either if it's a longer term student debt, the way you've structured it, you might treat it more like a mortgage. But if it's something that's shorter term, and if it's a necessity and you want to, you see yourself as needing to pay it off more quickly, then you might count that as a deduction against your zakatable wealth. So that is something that depends on the circumstances. But in any case, the overall principle is that the longer term debt, we look at the current portion, the short term debt, we take as a offset against the other assets. Let's move to the next slide, please. So our guiding ayah from the Quran regarding zakah outlines 8 categories of recipients. And the first, إنما الصدقات للفقراء والمساكين والعاملين عليها والمؤلفة قلوبهم وفي الرقاب والغارمين وفي سبيل الله وابن السبيل. So the poor, the fuqara. So the fuqara are the people are the kind of chronically poor, people who are in a situation of poverty as we would recognize it, that's first category. The masakin, and this is very relevant for us as we think about current crises and hardships. So masakin are economically insecure people who might actually have a business, might have a job, so they may have some income, but their income is not secure, their income is not sufficient for their needs, so they could fall into this masakin category. So not every miskin is unemployed, but they might be underemployed, or they might be struggling financially. Zakat administration. So certainly a portion of zakat can be used for the administration, and in fact, I think it's very important that we recognize that, because investing in the administrative capacity of zakat helps us make it more efficient in terms of the outcomes that it achieves. So it may cost dollars to have a zakat administrator, but of course that person can help find the most needy families, the most needy households, can follow up, make sure that it's efficiently utilized, and in fact, the zakat administration can create a great deal of value. In our context, especially as we had a webinar regarding the COVID situation, and the importance of helping people access resources. One can see why it's important to have administrators who are able to point people, particularly administrators in the form of social workers, who can point people who are eligible to social programs to those resources. And so they can get the resources to which they are entitled. And then, of course, we can top that up from other funds. But that's an excellent use of funding, is to point people to the resources that they are entitled to or otherwise eligible to. People in bondage, we may think of this, of course, as a historic legacy, but there are some interesting applications in terms of modern slavery, human trafficking, etc. Now, the debt-ridden, of course, that is applied to people who are in debt, but there are conditions in terms of what kind of debt it is and how needy they are. Fi sabilillah, this is a very important question, and if those of you who support many of our US-based 501c3s, you may be familiar with the zakat opinions that they have, and often the opinions they have are based on the idea that promoting a better understanding of Islam, promoting more accurate depictions of Muslims is the struggle in the path of God that is necessary, and therefore giving to them is zakat eligible. So that is often cited for many of our 501c3s. Displaced people, of course, is hugely important. When we look at the refugee population in the world, disproportionately it skews towards Muslim populations, and our zakat going to them is very important. In terms of so I think some contemporary matters of interpretation, and there are more that might appear in the slides itself. So I think in the current version that you see is not showing all the columns. But with regard to some contemporary matters of interpretation, there's the question of property transfer versus services. So historically, the property, the way that zakat has worked has been the transfer of property from one person to another. Increasingly now we see zakat being given to institutions that provide services to those who are eligible to zakat. The question of who's eligible to be a zakat administrator is something that comes up more frequently now. For example, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, UNHCR, collects zakat now directly from individuals. And so it's acting as a zakat administrator in a way, which is a new phenomenon. This whole idea of what it means to, the category I mentioned about people whose hearts are to be reconciled, how do we apply that? And then the question of the path of God, how we understand that. Now, there are some very good, contemporary practices with philanthropy that I would encourage us to think about applying to our zakah. So, for instance, I'm holding a book here called Giving Done Right, and it's by an author who's named Phil Buchanan. He's an expert on philanthropy, and there are many such books that talk about the need for impact assessment, for measuring how the charity that one gives is being utilized. And we have tools available like Charity Navigator and others, but it is important for us to be mindful of impact assessment. Grant-based giving is very important. I am personally a trustee of an organization called the Pillars Fund, which is a very important and I think interesting organization for pooled philanthropy, by which families have gotten together, pool their philanthropy, institutions apply to it, and then grants are given. And grant making adds a layer of discipline, of result orientation, of governance that most of us as individuals are not able to do. And of course, for those who have larger fortunes and larger zakah pools to give, the idea of family foundations is important. I see the questions in the box. We'll take them, inshallah, after we finish these two slides. With regards to structuring and tax efficiency, one tool I would highlight as being very relevant is what are called donor-advised funds. Now, donor-advised fund is in essence very similar to having one's own foundation or one's own 501c3 without creating that infrastructure. So to do this, one connects with a foundation that offers donor-advised funds. You have an account with them, and what it does, very importantly, is it allows you to separate the time when you give the funds to the donor-advised fund from the time when you distribute the funds. So, for instance, if you have a capital gain event, let's say you own a property and you sell it, and so there's a higher than usual tax liability, you may want to put funds into your DAF in a high amount that year, and then pay your zakat from that for the next, say, 2 or 3 years, because of course zakat is an annual obligation, so you would want to pay it on an annual basis. However, you would like to take the benefit of the tax benefit of the gift in the first year because you have an extraordinary income event. So that could be a sale of a property, that could be another form of extraordinary income. And I know for many of you on the call or on the Zoom, this could be very relevant. Also, for the time that you have the assets in the donor advised fund, it can grow, it can be invested, and of course, it grows because it's in a charitable foundation, all of that will eventually go to charity. There's also an important benefit, which is when you give to a donor advised fund, the charity that you're giving to, your named charity on your tax return, is the foundation. And when the foundation in turn gives grants, let's say to MCGP, then it's between the foundation and MCGP. So if you would like to maintain the privacy of the charities to whom you give, and if you itemize your deductions, then having a donor advised fund creates a layer of privacy, which could be useful for some of us. It's also very important to be aware of the benefit of gifting appreciated assets. Now, when we have an asset, and the most simple and common example would be stock. And so once stock is, if you look at your brokerage account, let's say you own a share in Apple, and let's say that share is worth $100 today, and you bought that share for $50. If you were to sell that, then of course you would be taxed on the difference between the 50 and the 100, the capital gain. However, if you were to give that stock in charity to your donor advised fund or to another institution, then you would get the tax benefit of the full $100 value, which over time can be quite meaningful for a highly appreciated asset. So for those who have such assets in their portfolio, it is always better for you from a tax perspective to give from the appreciated asset, so give the stock. And then if you want to buy the stock again, you can of course buy it with your cash. But if your choice is between giving cash and giving an appreciated asset, from a tax perspective, it's better to give the appreciated asset. Finally, from the slides, before we get into the questions, slide number 5. The intent of our conversation today is to be more mindful about our zakat, to think about it in more detail, be strategic in the implementation. We talked about, the importance of being mindful of the impact. Being involved it's important. Now, some of us tend to think of zakah purely as an act of worship, so we've done it, and once it's done, we don't want to think about it. But from a systemic perspective, it's very beneficial that zakat givers pay attention to how the zakat is used and make sure that we are optimizing it for social benefit. And I'll close with a very profound ayah in the Quran that talks about zakah from Surah Al-Mu'minun, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ الَّذِينَ هُمْ فِي صَلَاتِهِمْ خَاشِعُونَ وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ عَنِ اللَّغْوِ مُعْرِضُونَ وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِلزَّكَاةِ فَاعِلُونَ. So indeed successful are the believers, those who in their prayers are focused, are devout, and concentrated in their prayers, and those who turn away from idle talk or from laghu, idle discussion and idle chatter, and those who with their zakah are fa'ilun, doers of zakah. So not only giving zakah, but also doing zakah, meaning being active in that and being attentive to that act. There's a worksheet that you'll see on the next sheet, slide, which I can share with anyone who's interested in terms of how you would some of the points that we talked about, and for you to reflect on how they're relevant for your own circumstances. And so that could be made available, inshallah, to those who'd like to see it afterwards. With that, I will answer a couple of questions here, and then we can take further questions as they arise. The first question that we haven't yet addressed yet is how do you calculate zakat on ETFs, mutual funds? So mutual funds or ETFs are an aggregation of stocks. So it's the same analysis that we did before. So you can look at stocks as a cash-like or liquid asset, because it certainly has some of those features that immediately sellable, etc. And in which case you would pay 2.5% on that for what you've held for 1 year. And the net value for the year would be the maximum value that you had for the course of that 1 year, which was a question that someone asked before. So the question has come a number of times about the fluctuation. Hopefully we've addressed that. Let me move down here. What is the time frame in the year that you pay zakah, that one pays zakah? As I mentioned, zakah can be paid throughout the year. There's a benefit in paying zakah throughout the year, and in fact, in traditional societies, people would pay zakah as they gain, their income came in, because people would not necessarily have as regular incomes as we're used to. There's a benefit, of course, in doing it in Ramadan, but also at other times of the year, it's good to do. And what one would want to do is keep track of the when you gave your zakah, and make sure that you are not lapsing more than 12 lunar months from when it's due. Can zakat be paid towards construction of the mosque? Can we use fi sabilillah to justify this in the USA? There are certainly opinions to this effect. Scholars who say that in contexts like the United States, where fi sabilillah would mean helping the Muslim community establish itself, giving to the mosque could be a zakat eligible activity. So that is one opinion among scholars. For the person who asked this question, you can contact me and I can give you more information on this. The traditional form of zakah, as we mentioned, is a transfer of property from individual to individual. However, there has been thinking on giving institutionally. And certainly MCGP has a zakat fund. So of course, if you specifically give to the Zakat fund, the administration has guidelines and principles by which they use it for these 8 categories of Zakat that we spoke about. So I presume the question pertains to not these 8 categories, or not the poor and the needy per se, but rather for the Masjid administration overall. For UN refugees, UNHCR has a public website which is accessible, which has a platform, an online portal where one can give zakat. It would actually go through, I believe, through a US entity called the UNHCR Foundation. You get a tax receipt from them. You would indicate that this is your zakat, and they would put it into the zakat fund. Yes, Sajid highlighted we did not have the masjid logo by mistake. Yes, this is a program on behalf of the masjid, does not promote any particular individual or business or any venture. This is a masjid activity hosted by MCGP, and there was an oversight that was not in the flyer. So you pay zakat based on the money you have to indicate. Right. So there's a question about, do you pay from your salary regardless? No. So of course it's always good. It's good to give sadaqah on an ongoing basis, and I would certainly always encourage one to do that. However, if one is spending, for example, their salary every month, such that they have nominal or minimal savings, then one would not have to calculate 2.5% of their salary and pay zakat on that. What you would do is you would look. So let's say, for example, you're giving your zakat this week on the 1st of Ramadan. You would look back at what you had 1 year ago, the 1st of Ramadan last year, and you would see if your assets today are less than what they were before, then you would give on the lower amount. If they were less than, so yeah, we would take the lower of the 2 amounts, and then you would pay your zakat on that, a net of the debts, as we talked about. The debt I would suggest that you look at the scholarly opinions regarding current debt, so not necessarily long-term debt, but rather debts that are more immediate in nature. So the question of 401k, yes. So as I said, 401k. If the 401k is your property, which it is under most 401k plans, it is legally your property, then it would be it would be subject to zakat. However, the value is not necessarily exactly what you see on the statement, because if you were to withdraw from the 401k, it would not be at that value. So if you want to have a very precise calculation of your zakat obligation on a 401k, then what you would do is understand the rules of distribution and apply zakat to the value, the withdrawal value that you have. Yes, this was someone wanted to ask a question out loud, which I think we can certainly do.
Is that okay?
Yes, and yeah, please go ahead. And if you want to raise a comment that you made in the chat to Dr. Manya, please go ahead.
Okay. It's a long 2-part question. And I'm sure this is a question that many people have in their minds. If someone has, suppose, $100,000 for the first 10 months of the year, and at the end of the year, it goes up to 200,000. I'm guessing that because you got to have that money for the whole year, that you pay zakat on the 100,000, not what is at the end of the year. That's part one.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the second part, I think you may have partly answered already. If somebody is less than 65 or 68 and he cannot take all the money out, I am assuming that you take 10% penalty out, and then 1/3 or whatever the tax is on the rest, and then pay 2.5% on the amount left that you would have gotten if you took it out. Is that correct or no?
The second is certainly that's what I would do. Is the second one, Dr. Manya. Regarding the first question, if we take the position on the lower amount, which is what I was discussing earlier, then that holds. Except, of course, the example you raised was quite a dramatic increase in the wealth. Now that wealth, when it comes to 1 year from receiving that, so let's say on January 1st you had $100,000, and then on July 1st that doubled, and then came the end of the year, and you're saying, now what is my zakat? And your practice is to give your zakat at the end of the year. Yes, you could look back and say, a year ago I had 100, so I'll pay zakat on that. However, if you continue to have that 200, the additional 100 over the course of the next year, then the zakat on that would not be due December 31st of 2021. It would be due July 1st of 2021. Right?
Yeah, I agree. So at the end of the following year, when you've had 200,000 for the whole year, then you pay.
Correct.
On the 200K.
Correct.
That's
and of course, then it's due. So I'll tell you, people have different personal practices, but some people, just for simplicity, what they'll do is they'll calculate, they'll pay, and then that way they don't have to go through the process that I just discussed of tracking when the money came in. So that's, if we're not talking about, drastic shifts, that's probably the more straightforward method.
Okay, thank you.
There was a comment made that Sheikh Mendez has stated that in his view, giving to the masjid is not a zakat eligible activity. I'm sure he means the masjid administration, not of course the zakat fund. The zakat fund clearly is zakat eligible. This is I have not discussed this with Sheikh Mendez. His position is the consensus, or the majority of scholarly opinions is consistent with that. So I did mention that there are opinions otherwise, but the jumhur of the scholars is indeed that zakat is the right of the poor on the rich, and we don't use it for institutions as noble as they are. Great. I don't see any further questions here in the chat. If anyone has questions, maybe this is zakat on rental property. So zakat on rental property is that you look at your net income from that property. So you look at the rents that came in, then you look at the expenses associated with that building, including the taxes, the maintenance, the charges that come out of it, and then you'll have your profit. On that profit, you would pay, in fact, 10%, not 2.5%, but 10% of the profit, which in almost every instance would be much lower than paying 2.5% of the value of the property. But that is the practice that's recommended in the sources that I've highlighted. Yes, zakat is on wealth, absolutely. So right, so the question, so rental income is income, zakat is on wealth. Right, so the way that this is reconciled is that the analogy for rental income is on crops. So again, I can point the questioner to the resources on this, but on crops, so when people would farm and they would give their zakat, they would give from the crops that they had, and not they would not hold those for a year and then give from that. So that's the analogy that's used for real estate. What about income tax and the stimulus pack payment? What is the obligation? So if you receive your stimulus check and you spend it the next day or the next week, then of course it would not be in your possession for 1 year. You would not pay zakat on it. So to the degree that it contributes to your wealth, and you hold on to that wealth for a sustained period of time, that's when you would look at the zakat obligation. Great.
Assalamu
Wa alaikum assalam, Brother Tahir.
Assalamu alaikum. How are you? Jazakallah khair, mashallah. Excellent. I have two questions. One is, as you mentioned, I think rightly so, the zakat funds flowing through the donor advised fund DAF has to be given out by the DAF in the same year, because zakat has to be paid out in the same calendar year or the same zakat year. Because if you part with the money from your personal account to your donor advised fund, and the donor advised fund now have to identify those 501c3s who are zakat eligible. In that case, also MCGP has the zakat fund as well.
Yes.
So as long as we can earmark that, well, those at zakat has to be paid from the DAF to MCGP for the zakat fund.
Right.
But has to pay the same year. Would that obligated DAF has to pay the same year?
No. So basically, an individual zakat obligation is a function of his or her total wealth. Right. So what I was referring to in terms of a key benefit of the DAF, or the donor advised fund, is that if you have an extraordinary income event, which is, in excess of what your annual zakat would be, which often happens, right? So you might have a situation like that. That's when you would put it into the donor advised fund. And then you would say, okay, now it's time for me to give my zakat. I can give it from my assets that are sitting outside the DAF, or I can give it from the DAF. And so if you, what I was discussing here was to say that you would give it, you would use the DAF to separate the timing of your tax deduction from the timing of your zakat distribution.
Yes, and the second question is, obviously, if I'm transferring an appreciated asset, let's just talk about $100 as my zakat fund to the DAF. Now that value goes half after I make the transfer in the DAF. So the asset is depreciating after the transfer, although I have paid in full according to what I owed. But I know that has not reached out to the final beneficiary as total amount.
Correct. So then you would look at it, because the fiqh of this that I've discussed with, I consulted with a scholar on this for my own personal DAF. So that is that you treat the DAF as part of your assets, because although it's legally sitting in a different entity, you do have distribution rights over it. So what you do is, if the asset has depreciated in value, you treat it at its current value when it comes time for zakat. So you wouldn't say that I gave it at this value. You would say it currently is worth X.
Got it.
So when it goes into the DAF, as you rightly pointed out, it's not gone to zakat yet. It's only gone to zakat when it's left the DAF to the zakat eligible source or destination.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you.
So,
MashaAllah.
Walaikum assalam.
Aamir, Assalamualaikum.
Walaikum assalam. Yes, go ahead, Brother Sajid. Thank you.
I'd like to, first of all, thank you for an excellent presentation. In addition, I'd also like to acknowledge your father, who I see is online. So, Dr. Abdul Rehman, if you want to say a few words, we welcome that. Aamir's father, who's also the...
And I was listening to it.
Rumi circle at the masjid.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, now I was listening to this and I enjoyed the talk, but again, I'm impressed by the services that your center provides, really. Besides this, other activities that you guys do. So I really appreciate that. But yes, thanks for asking me to speak. I really don't have much to add. I have given you my scholar and he has done a great job.
Alhamdulillah.
Everything, yes.
Alhamdulillah. Thank you. Thank you, Dr.
Assalamu alaikum, Brother Aamir.
Yes, walaikum assalam. Brother Masood, please.
Yes, I put the question, but I guess it was missed. So this, I think, is still a little bit of a confusing regarding the 401k.
Okay.
You mentioned that it should be what you are going to withdraw.
No,
but
what? Sorry, please.
What you're going to withdraw, and zakat will be required on that. But you keep putting the money in the 401k for 20 years. So what do you do in those 20 years? That's the main question.
Right. No, absolutely. So to clarify, we're talking in the interim, So each year, so you would be, you would have your 401k statement, right? So let's say your 401k is telling you that you have $100,000 in that account. Now, as Dr. Manya also was pointing out in his question, that 100,000, although legally your property, is actually not worth 100,000 to you, because if you were to withdraw it, first of all, you'd pay a 10% penalty, and second, you'd pay tax on it, right? So maybe its ultimate value to you is, let's say, 60,000. So the view that we would take here is to say that you don't pay zakat on the full 100,000, because that's not the value of your wealth. The value of your wealth, which is actually attainable to you or attributable to you today, is 60% of that. So you would take that number, and that's what you use for your zakat.
Jazakallah khair. That's clear now. Thank you.
Brother Aamir, Assalamu alaikum.
Welcome. Good to see you.
This is Zahid. How are you?
Yes, very well, thank you. So good to see you.
Alhamdulillah. You mentioned in the beginning that there's one view where 401 is considered as property, and then you pay whatever, like 10%, just like you deal with property at the end of the year.
Sorry, is that the end of the question, Brother Zahid?
Yeah, so my question was that you had, in the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that there were some scholarly views that 401k can be considered as property. And then at the end of the year, let's say your 401k was 100,000 in the beginning of the year, and at the end of the year it became 200, then you pay the zakat, whatever is the rise at 10% value, because you are considering it as a property.
So Brother Tahir, we can hear you, Brother Tahir.
So I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
Yes, Brother Zahid. No, what I was referring to is that, so the 401k is simply a shell for holding assets. The question is the stock, or the assets within it, which are stocks. So as I said, there are two opinions regarding stocks. One opinion is to treat stocks like cash, whether they be in the 401k or elsewhere. And the other is to treat it the way you would treat either a property, like a rental property, or a private business that you might own, which would be very relevant for many people on this Zoom. So in that case, Brother Zahid, you would be paying 10% not on the value, but on the profits that you generate from that enterprise or that business. But that's a question of being a stock, not whether it sits in the 401k or on your personal account.
Okay. Okay. Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much.
And it's quite challenging if one takes the view of that it's a business that one owns, and you want to take your attributable income. The calculation of that becomes quite challenging. So if you own a share of Procter & Gamble, for example, to then try to allocate your profits from it is an exercise. So I think many people prefer simply to pay the 2.5%, which is a safer approach. And ultimately, it's important to remember zakah is a minimum obligation for charity, but of course it's always good to give more, and there's great benefit in giving more. So if you're going to if you want to be careful here, and in fact, if you're going to overestimate, of course, that's much safer than the opposite, which would be to underestimate.
Definitely. Jazakallah. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum
Brother
assalam.
Aamir, thank you for this. This is Zach Mania.
Yes.
Thank you for this beautiful, informative talk. I see that Sheikh Mendez is on line too. Sheikh Mendez, if you would like to give a 1 or 2 minute your opinion as to what you heard, if possible.
Assalamu alaikum. Yeah, I mean, there's a valid difference of opinion, and I think Aamir summed it up nicely. There's nothing really I want to add except that the Fiqh Council of North America and other fiqh councils have written a number of articles on this issue. If anyone's interested in reviewing them, and I don't know if did you reference those?
I did not reference the fiqh council, but no. But of course, there would be very valuable resources.
Sure, yeah. So, I think, again, like with issues like these, everyone needs to really understand that this is not just about, paying something to fulfill a duty. This is really about your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and giving the poor their haqq, their right. So the zakat, the spirit of zakat, and this is important to understand, brothers and sisters, the spirit of zakat is the spirit of knowing that the portion of zakat that's due on your wealth does not belong to you. It does not belong to you. It belongs to the poor, the masakin, the fuqara, inshallah. And our masjid, I think it's important that I sit down with Brother Aamir and with our scholars, and we come up with at least some kind of position paper for our masjid on the issue, because this always comes up every Ramadan.
MashaAllah. Jazakallah khair. Thank you, Sheikh. And certainly, as we mentioned earlier, it's the right of the poor on the rich. At the same time, it's also a purification which we desperately need from our wealth. And the idea that if we do not pay our zakah, we risk this impurity in our rizq, and that is disastrous spiritually. So thank you, Sheikh, for reminding us of that.
Jack Mania again, sorry. Imam very well said that zakat, we get stuck with these things. Should we give to this person or that person, or how much? But actually the deeper meaning of zakat, from what I understand, especially from having spoken to you, Sheikh, is the spirit of giving. That it's your connection between you and your Lord as to who are you giving to, whether it's going to the right place or wrong place, but as long as you did your best, try to help others in need, even God forbid if it goes into the wrong hands, at least you've done your part. So I think that was a very good take I got from you, Sheikh. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And it shouldn't be lost on us that the word zakat has a dual meaning. It means to purify, and it means to grow.
Yeah.
And so as we purify our wealth, you remove whatever is preventing your wealth from even growing and profiting more. And then also as you give, you're purifying your own heart from stinginess and miserliness, so that you grow spiritually. Mm-hmm. And so again, I really want to encourage people. I think Sheikh Ubaidullah, or one of our scholars, Sheikh Yahya said, to us that we want to be careful from making our deen. No, I think it was Sheikh Nihal Khan, who actually said, we need to be careful about fatwa shopping, right? Mm-hmm. Looking for the fatwa, looking for the scholarly opinion that fits our desires, right? And really be about truth seeking. And so on this issue of the 401k, I've heard a lot of different positions. And again, we have to look at what is closest to the letter and to the spirit of the Quran. And may Allah give us guidance and success. But thank you so much, Aamir Bhai, for your words and your comments.
And subhanAllah, that's the principle, of course, with zakah is that it is an act of worship. And so when we look at other in an analysis of jurisprudential rulings, there's this role for maslaha, where you look at benefit and harm, etc. When it comes to zakah, of course, because it's an act of worship, we need to be extra careful that we are obedient. So it's not, as Sheikh Mendez beautifully said, we need to be careful that we're not looking for opinions that are most suited towards us, and that also we're approaching this from a an obedient posture.